I think that there's still significant interest and pent up enthusiasm for sports, both from a media consumption perspective, but also from a live attendance perspective. I kind of want to tackle that question in kind of three areas, and one is TV viewership, the other is around digital consumption, and then finally around attitudes of consumers to attending live sports events. So if we think about TV viewership, what we saw was a real ratings boost on the return to sports. That kicked off really with virtual sports, back in April, May, with NASCAR and IndyCar running a number of virtual racing series that were broadcast on live linear television, and actually secured ratings that were even better than some of the traditional broadcasts. They then came back on force in May with strong ratings. And we continue to see that pattern as sports either came back or it started its seasons, a very strong opening to the seasons. But generally, we saw a little bit of a decline in TV viewership once the seasons got into full flow. I'd say the exceptions to that were motorsports and golf that managed to sustain fairly strong viewing year over year, despite the pandemic and despite the competitive programming that was in place. We should also probably highlight the September to October period. That was a very busy period in media, and in particular in sports, with all of the major leagues participating at the same time, as well as big events like the US Open tennis on at that time. And then we obviously had significant interest around the presidential election, but also the kind of the increased programming, news programming around the pandemic, and viewership overall in that September to October period around live sports declined versus 2019. That decline was in line with overall viewership to television, and was obviously impacted also by out of home audiences, which were nearly as significant in 2020 as they were in 2019. But there were some really interesting bright spots there as well in the 18 to 24-year-old and the 55 plus heavy viewers of live sports events. Their consumption of live sports actually increased year over year over that period. So if you then sort of think about digital consumption and obviously the move to more virtual events, the increased competition through live linear programming with all the events taking place at the same time, we actually saw quite a significant uptick in digital consumption. So we tracked an annual increase of 11 million consumers aged between 25 to 54 across the top 5 digital platforms in September versus prior year. So clearly showing the increased media fragmentation in the marketplace, but also consumers going to digital platforms for their sports fix. And then I think finally, I just want to touch on attitudes to consumers, and principally around attending live events. And my sports group conducted a survey around the return to live sports through the period of May to October. And there were some interesting findings coming out of that. So I'll run through a couple of those. The number of respondents agreeing that a league or organization will need to ensure public health and safety before fans begin attending their live sports events grew 10% from the period of May through to October. And that now represents 75% of the sports fan audience. And then another interesting fact there was around the attendance of live events. And those are agreeing that attending live events is still the best way to experience fandom. That grew by 24% from May to October, and now represents about 2/3 of sports fans, growing from 50% of sports fans at the start of the pandemic. So clearly, there is still strong interest in sports, pent up both from a media consumption perspective, but also from a live attendance perspective.
John, what about the buy side, the advertisers, the marketers? What are the opportunities for them? There's still a great deal of reach. As you mentioned, there are some issues around ratings, but there's also sort of new creative things around sponsorships in stadium. Tell us about, how the marketplace is evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, what I'll say is no real impact to the change in investment in sponsorship rights. If you think about it, the major sponsorships run over a number of years. What we did see is a shift of sponsorship activation spend with the lack of live experiential opportunities, and that obviously shifted more to social and digital channels. So we did see a growth in that sector. But I think, look, the big opportunity is for brands is, surviving and thriving in this hybrid world that we're going to live in, where, live events and live entertainment, attending those are going to be very important. But so is playing in a virtual world and brands and advertisers being present where people are congregating around social and digital platforms. I think that's the big thing for the sports industry is how do they best play in that virtual and digital environment alongside the live environment where they have thrived for so many years. And I think marketeers in general are becoming more sophisticated. I think COVID has accelerated the need for sophistication around measurements of sponsorship investments. I think really what they're looking for is better understanding of the sales-based return of their sponsorship investments, both in the short term but also the long term, and then benchmarking how their sponsorship investments compare to their wider marketing portfolio investments. And that's an area that we're placing a lot of focus on at the moment in Nielsen is driving outcomes and understanding better the real business impact and sales impact around sponsorship investments.
Now, let's talk about demographics and the young people. And we've sort of read quite a lot about the need, the interest, the issues around attracting and retaining younger viewers to live sports. How do you see that developing, and what could the industry do?
Yeah, look, I think I go back to my previous point is sports needs to play where the younger viewers and the younger consumers are congregating, and so that needs to be more in a virtual and digital world. And sports needs to draw on a lot of the success of the games and esports environment and some of the major publishers in that space, like Twitch, and also the game publishers like Epic, who produce the game Fortnite. So I think there's a lot of learning lessons to take from the esports and games environment into the sports business. But the key things for me are discovery. So we need to be able to tell young consumers, they need to be able to find where the sports content is, and then you talk about content. What sort of content should we be serving them? We need to be serving them both short form and long form content. Hook them onto short form content to drive them then to long form content, and that means playing in the spaces around around YouTube, around TikTok and things to drive kind of interest to both long form broadcasts on linear TV, but also through digital and streaming platforms. And then I think the final thing is understanding the outcomes of this, and how this is actually driving a change in behavior and therefore consumption in those sports. But really it's about crossing the divide from the live and the linear broadcast experience into the sort of digital and virtual experience.